Imagine walking into one of the most extravagant palaces ever built, walls coated in gold, chandeliers dazzling like stars, and enough silk draped around to clothe a kingdom. But inhale too deeply, and you'd be knocked flat by a stench so strong it could kill a bouquet of roses from across the room. Welcome to the Palace of Versailles in the 17th century, where opulence met filth, beauty hid decay, and royal women, no matter how bejeweled or highborn, were trapped in a nightmare of unspeakable hygiene. Today, we're diving headfirst, thankfully not literally, into the shockingly dirty lives of France's noble women at the height of royal glory. These are the 5 worst hygiene habits of the royal court's leading ladies, and you're not ready for what's coming. But before we dive into this tale of filth, survival, and powdered misery, if you love uncovering the hidden sides of history's most powerful dynasties, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from. It's amazing that we're connecting across centuries and continents to explore the cost of power and the women who paid it. If you were born into nobility in 17th century France, your life revolved around elegance, charm, and flawless fashion. But when it came to staying clean, things took a grim turn. Because back then, bathing, something we now see as essential, was seen as dangerous. Medical theories of the time claimed warm water opened the pores, allowing invisible diseases to sneak in. Add to that the church's stern warnings that public baths were places of sin and vanity, and you had a whole culture turning its back on water altogether. Royal women had no private bathtubs, no steamy showers, no scented bubble baths. Most rarely bathed at all. A full body wash was seen as unnecessary, even risky or immoral. Instead, noble women would wipe down their faces, hands, and maybe their necks with cloth slightly dampened. But not with water. No, with vinegar, spirits, or even their own saliva. Anything to avoid opening the pores. And when a real bath did happen, which was rare, it was often a group affair. Families would share the same tub, one after the other. Naturally, the men went first. By the time a woman slipped in, the water was murky, tepid, and filled with remnants of everyone before her, assuming there was any water left at all. At Versailles, the smell wasn't confined to the stables. Guests routinely commented on the palace's overwhelming stench, a bizarre blend of old perfume, sweat, mildew, and animal grease. It wasn't that the royals didn't care about their appearance, quite the opposite, but their definition of clean was different. Women were expected to be icons of refinement, their skin powdered, their gowns pristine, their jewelry gleaming. But underneath, skin untouched by soap for months. It was the ultimate contradiction. Immaculate from a distance, revolting up close. And if that wasn't bad enough, the next hygiene horror is something we completely take for granted today: the toilet. Versailles may have been an architectural wonder, home to kings and queens, dripping in luxury, but it was almost entirely toiletless. Hundreds of rooms, thousands of courtiers, and barely a working bathroom. Instead, chamber pots, ceramic bowls tucked under beds, hidden behind tapestries, stashed in corners. When nature called, you'd use the pot. And once it was full, if you were lucky, a servant emptied it. If not, out the nearest window it went. If the wind shifted the wrong way or the streets below were too crowded, someone outside might receive a truly disgusting surprise. And some nobles didn't even bother with chamber pots. Men were often seen urinating off balconies or relieving themselves right in the palace gardens. Visiting diplomats were horrified, and rightly so. This wasn't the occasional accident, it was the norm. Versailles had a reputation, not just for its grandeur, but for its unbearable stench. The palace corridors were often used as makeshift toilets. Imagine being a noblewoman, gliding through marble halls in layers of embroidered silk, lifting your skirts not for elegance but to avoid stepping in human waste. Things got so bad that by 1715, the crown had to issue an official decree. The palace floors must be cleaned once a week. Not daily, not even after grand events. Once. That was the improvement. Now, let's talk about wiping, or the lack thereof. Toilet paper? Unheard of. People made do with whatever they had: scraps of cloth, hay, leaves, or in the most desperate cases, their own hands. And proper hand washing? Rare. Which meant that with open windows serving as the main form of waste disposal and cleaning done by guesswork, disease and parasites spread like wildfire. And yet, amid all this filth, fashion thrived. Nowhere was that more obvious than in the towering hairstyles of the court's elite women. These weren't mere hairstyles, they were sculptures, engineering marvels, hairdos that rose feet above the scalp, topped with lace, pearls, fake flowers, miniature garden, even tiny ships sailing through a sea of powdered curls. To hold these massive creations together, women used metal cages, horsehair stuffing, cotton padding, and most importantly, pomade made from beef fat. This greasy mix molded the style in place, but it also created a warm, sticky haven for lice. Since women rarely washed their hair or removed their wigs for cleaning, infestations weren't just common, they were expected. Whole colonies of lice lived inside these styles. Ladies kept ornate silver tools, long-handled lice claws, to scratch their scalps discreetly without ruining their appearance. It wasn't unusual to see a court lady pause at dinner, lift a hand to her temple, and give herself a graceful little scratch between sips of wine. Despite the itching, despite the smell of old grease, missing the fashion parade wasn't an option. At Versailles, appearances were everything. Your look defined your status. To show up out of style was to invite social death. So even if your head was crawling, the wig stayed on, because the show had to go on. And wigs weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Some were so heavy they caused chronic neck and back pain. Others caught fire from nearby candles. But nobles wore them anyway. That was the price of power and prestige. Poor women, in contrast, simply shaved their heads to avoid the hassle and the lice. But for aristocratic women, their hair, or what looked like hair, was their crown. Even if it was secretly a nest of pests hidden under layers of grease and ribbons. Now, let's turn to something that should have been a comfort: food. After all, the royal feasts of Versailles were legendary. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted pheasants, meat pies, candied fruits, and golden pastries. But behind the glittering feasts and golden platters lurked a stomach-turning truth. The royal kitchens were just as plagued by Versailles' sanitation horrors as the rest of the palace, if not more. The plumbing was so disastrously poor that raw sewage sometimes flowed back into the very rooms where meals were prepared. It's even recorded that, on at least one occasion, wastewater reached the private kitchen of Queen Marie Antoinette herself. The results? Catastrophic for food safety. Without refrigeration, proper ventilation, or basic waste management, food contamination was rampant. Meat spoiled fast, produce sat out for days, rats, insects, and other pests scurried freely through the sculleries. And still, the royal chefs had no choice but to continue cooking and serving food, no matter how questionable, to the highest echelons of society. The consequences were brutal: diarrhea, vomiting, food poisoning, all common. But worse were the parasites. Intestinal worms, especially tapeworms, infected countless members of the royal court. Thanks to undercooked meat and filthy conditions, even King Louis XIV himself wasn't spared. Historical accounts claim he once passed a 6-inch-long tapeworm, proof that no title could protect you from the very real price of poor hygiene. And while the food itself was treacherous, dining was still a carefully choreographed performance, especially for women. Court ladies were expected to eat with elegance, laugh, flirt, and entertain, all while hiding nausea, stomach cramps, or worse. They endured it all in silence, sacrificing comfort for appearances. And now we arrive at perhaps the most personal and painful part of a royal woman's life: childbirth. For noble women, labor wasn't just agonizing, it was public. In 17th century France, when a queen or high ranking lady gave birth, it became a national event. The birthing chamber was filled with courtiers, clergy, physicians, and aristocrats, not there to help, just to observe. When Queen Marie Therese went into labor, the room was so overcrowded it resembled a theatre more than a medical space. Why the spectacle? Fear of scandal. There was always suspicion that a stillborn or female child might be secretly replaced by a healthy male heir. To prevent such rumors, royal births had to happen in full view of witnesses. This meant that as she endured unimaginable pain, the mother was surrounded by onlookers. No privacy, no dignity, only pressure. Marie Antoinette famously fainted after giving birth, overwhelmed by the heat, stress, and crush of bodies in her chamber. And she wasn't the only one. Many women collapsed, cried out, or suffered complications while essentially performing their agony for an audience. And childbirth in that era was anything but safe. With almost no medical knowledge, no sterile tools, and no antibiotics, the dangers were immense. 1 in 3 children didn't live past the age of 3. Mothers faced terrifying odds. Infections from unwashed hands and crude instruments claimed many lives. So while the birth of a royal baby might have been a moment of national joy, for the woman giving birth, it was more often a moment of fear, pain, and vulnerability. The psychological toll was staggering. And there you have it, 5 unsettling truths hiding behind the golden walls of Versailles. Beneath the perfume-drenched halls, beneath the silk gowns and jeweled crowns, the women of the French court lived lives marked by discomfort, humiliation, and danger. They smiled in public, but in private they scratched, suffered, and endured. Their stories are rarely told, but they deserve to be remembered. So if you ever thought royal life was all banquets and ball gowns, think again. The reality? Far messier and far more human. Until next time, keep exploring the past. Because history isn't just fascinating, sometimes it's downright filthy.